I spent the night of my daughter's wedding sitting alone in the dress I'd bought for her big day, the same dress she told me not to wear because I was no longer invited. I thought the silence would crush me, but what I didn't expect was a knock at my door the next morning. And her new husband standing there in tears. This isn't just a story about betrayal. It's about how the deepest heartbreak can lead you to the strongest version of yourself. Stay with me because what happened next changed everything. The coffee had gone cold hours ago, untouched on the kitchen counter. Margaret, Maggie to those who once knew her well, sat in the kitchen chair. Hands curled tight around the hem of the blush-colored dress she had bought months ago. The same dress she had dreamed of wearing while watching her daughter Emily walk down the aisle. The soft silk pooled around her legs, elegant and simple. Exactly the kind of thing Emily used to say she loved. Maggie had imagined this day so many times it felt almost rehearsed, standing by Emily's side as she slipped into her gown, laughing nervously as she pinned the necklace, the one she had crafted with so much love, around her daughter's neck. Squeezing her hand, in those final moments before the ceremony began, she had seen it all in her mind's eye. The music swelling the shared smiles, the tears they would wipe from each other's cheeks. But the house was silent. So devastatingly silent that her ears rang with the absence of it all. Because 2 days ago, a phone call had shattered those carefully laid dreams. Mom Emily's voice had been firm, unrecognizable, almost clinical. "I think it's better if you don't come." There had been no explanation, no fight, no plea, just 7 words dropped into the space between them like stones. Maggie had stood frozen, her hand still clutching the shopping bag that held the pearl earrings she had bought as a surprise gift for Emily's wedding morning. The phone call ended before she could even find words to ask why. Now she sat unmoving in the center of her own kitchen, the ticking clock on the wall measuring a time she no longer belonged to. It was nearly noon. The ceremony had already started. Maggie caught herself glancing at the clock again, knowing it made no difference. She wasn't there. She wasn't part of it. The coffee grew colder. The silence grew heavier. She hadn't cried. Not yet. There was something about the pain that felt too big, too wide for tears. Instead, she clung to the edge of the kitchen table as if it might anchor her to the present, keep her from unraveling altogether. In the living room, a carefully wrapped gift still sat on the side table. A delicate box with a gold-foiled bow holding a necklace. A small heart-shaped pendant engraved with the words, "Always your mom." Maggie had imagined presenting it to Emily on the morning of her wedding, a token of all the years, the struggles, the fierce, endless love that had knitted their lives together. But now the box felt like a relic from a story that had never been written. Maggie's eyes traced the familiar outlines of her kitchen. The worn wooden cabinets she had painted herself when Emily was 9, the sun-faded curtains that Emily used to hide behind during games of hide-and-seek. This room had been a witness to every season of their life. Birthday pancakes, homework, battles, late-night confessions whispered over steaming cups of cocoa, and yet today it stood as hollow as she felt. She tried briefly to imagine an alternate ending. Maybe Emily would call. Maybe there had been a mistake. Maybe she would knock on the door, tears in her eyes, apologizing, saying, "I can't do this without you, Mom." But no knock came. No call. Just the steady ache of realizing that sometimes the ones you love most will choose to walk their most important paths without you. She pressed the palm of her hand against the cool surface of the table, grounding herself. In a different life, a different story. Maggie would be adjusting her hat in a church pew, smiling proudly as her daughter promised forever to the man she loved. Instead, she sat alone, a mother excised from the chapter she had once dreamed of co-authoring. Her body sagged with the weight of invisible grief, the kind that doesn't come with funerals or casseroles or condolences. Grief for something still living, breathing, happening just a few miles away, but without her. For a moment she let her eyes close. She could almost hear it, the wedding march. Emily's laugh, the clink of champagne glasses. She could almost see it. Her daughter, radiant, beaming, walking toward a future that no longer needed her mother as part of its backdrop. The clock ticked on. The coffee cooled, and Maggie, wrapped in the soft betrayal of her blush dress, finally understood. This day wasn't hers to mourn because she had never been invited to live it. Long before the silence, before the coldness that now blanketed her life, there had been only warmth. There had been Emily and Maggie and the world they built with nothing but grit, hope, and an endless reservoir of love. Emily had come into Maggie's life like a long-awaited sunrise after a night that refused to end. 5 years of fertility treatments, doctor's visits, and endless nights of prayer and heartbreak had preceded her arrival. When Maggie first held her after 14 hours of labor during a thunderstorm, Emily's tiny hand had instinctively curled around her mother's finger as if claiming her place. And from that moment on, it had been them against everything. Emily's father had left before she could even speak. Her first word a ghost. Maggie had decided never to curse aloud. She wanted Emily to grow up believing in love, in loyalty, even if it was something Maggie herself had only experienced in fragments. So Maggie worked second-grade teacher by day, tutor by night, scrimping and stretching every dollar to build a life that might feel ordinary to her daughter, even if it cost Maggie every ounce of her own strength. She never complained, not when she was too tired to cook and microwaved macaroni for the 3rd night in a row, not when Emily needed a new pair of sneakers, and Maggie quietly skipped her own lunch to save for them, not when Christmas meant handmade gifts instead of store-bought treasures. The sacrifices had stacked quietly, invisibly, like bricks in a house no one else saw being built. Because Maggie had vowed from the very beginning that Emily would always feel the world was a safe place. That was her silent mission, her private promise. Birthdays were elaborate homemade affairs, cardboard castles crafted in the living room, scavenger hunts across the neighborhood, cupcakes topped with crooked towers of icing. Every science fair project was a 2-person effort, Emily brainstorming ideas while Maggie helped assemble volcanoes and solar system models out of cardboard and glitter. Every piano recital, every awkward school play, every parent-teacher conference. Maggie was there, sometimes rushing in with chalk dust still on her skirt from teaching all day, but smiling, clapping louder than anyone else. There were thunderstorms too, the literal kind and the metaphorical ones. On rainy nights, Emily would creep into Maggie's room, clutching a blanket and whispering, "Just until it passes, till." And Maggie, no matter how exhausted, would lift the covers without hesitation and make space for her, wrapping her daughter in an embrace that said without words, "You're safe. I'm here. Nothing will touch you while I'm breathing." Those years hadn't been perfect. No life ever is, but they had been full of burnt pancakes on Saturday mornings, full of car rides singing off-key to pop songs with the windows down, full of whispered secrets under blanket forts built with broomsticks and bedsheets. Full of love that didn't need fancy declarations because it was woven into every mundane moment. There had even been a little ritual on Friday nights, Maggie and Emily in matching pajamas, a giant bowl of popcorn between them, and a new movie picked from the bargain bin. No matter how busy or tired Maggie was, Friday night was sacred. It was their fortress, their little piece of the world where nothing could intrude. Maggie had held tightly to those moments even long after Emily outgrew them because they were the proof. Proof that for a long time she had done something right, that her love had created a world where her daughter could laugh without fear, dream without limitation, sleep without worrying about the roof over her head. The cost of that love, the exhaustion, the lonely nights, the dreams Maggie had shelved indefinitely had never mattered. Not to Maggie, because Emily's happiness had been enough. It was enough when Emily got her first acceptance letter to college. It was enough when Emily brought home her first paycheck and treated Maggie to dinner. It was enough when Emily called late at night just to say, "I love you, Mom. I just needed to hear your voice." Maggie had never needed medals or parades or public acknowledgement. Her reward was always in the quiet, the sleepy good nights, the handmade Mother's Day cards, the trust that Emily never withheld until recently. Sitting in her kitchen. Now. Maggie thought about those years, the way you think of a beloved photograph, worn thin from handling bright, beautiful, slightly faded around the edges, a past so full of meaning that it seemed almost impossible it could ever be rewritten, or worse, forgotten, yet somehow it had been. And in that realization, Maggie felt not anger, but grief. Not for what had happened now, but for all that had once been so fiercely, beautifully real. She closed her eyes and let herself remember fully without bitterness, because those golden years were hers. No cold voice on the phone, no empty seat at a wedding could take them away. They had existed. They had mattered. And no one, not even Emily herself, could ever erase that. The first time Maggie met Nathan, she had thought, finally, someone who truly sees her. He was soft-spoken, polite and attentive, in a way that didn't feel rehearsed. His brown eyes never strayed when Emily spoke. He listened like each word was something precious he was trying to memorize. Maggie had watched them from across her worn kitchen table, a cup of chamomile tea warming her hands, as Nathan laughed not loudly but genuinely at one of Emily's sarcastic jokes about dating apps. And in that moment, seeing her daughter so at ease, so incandescently happy, Maggie's heart had softened instantly toward him. Maybe she thought this would be the beginning of a new chapter, one they would all write together. Maybe the life she had worked so hard to build for Emily would now expand to include someone new, someone who cherished her daughter just as much as she did. When Nathan and Emily announced their engagement a year later, Maggie had cried, not tears of sadness but of pure, unadulterated joy. She envisioned dress fittings, cake tastings, late nights planning seating charts and laughing about how hard it was to pick the perfect floral arrangement. She bought a small leather-bound notebook and began jotting down ideas not to interfere but to be ready if Emily ever needed her quotes about marriage names of quaint little venues, even suggestions for songs to play during the mother-daughter dance. She wanted to be helpful. She wanted to be needed. But slowly, imperceptibly at first, something shifted. It started with small things Maggie in her eagerness had been all too willing to overlook. Phone calls that used to come daily stretched into every few days, then once a week. Coffee dates were rescheduled, then forgotten altogether. When Maggie texted Emily, ideas she had found excited messages filled with exclamation points and hearts. The replies were brief. "Thanks, Mom. I'll think about it." Or sometimes just, "Busy right now, we'll call later." Later rarely came. Maggie told herself it was just the stress of wedding planning. She remembered how overwhelming even simple events could feel when you wanted everything to be perfect. She gave Emily space, reminding herself that independence was a good thing, a thing she had always wanted for her daughter. But the space didn't shrink back once the stressful moments passed. It widened. Quietly, relentlessly. It wasn't just that Emily was busy. It was that somehow Maggie was no longer being invited into the busyness. One afternoon, Maggie found herself sitting on the porch steps, the leather notebook unopened on her lap, staring at the sunlight filtering through the trees. She realized she didn't know what color scheme Emily had chosen. She didn't know what song would play when Emily and Nathan shared their first dance. She didn't even know if she was supposed to give a toast. These were details she had assumed would include her assumed. Because for 24 years, Emily had included her in everything. From choosing prom dresses to picking out college dorm room sheets, Maggie had always been part of the decision-making, the excitement, the nervous laughter. Now Maggie felt like a guest at her own daughter's life. Not even a guest, really. More like a neighbor watching the lights flicker on in a house she used to call home. The worst part wasn't the exclusion itself. It was the realization that Emily didn't seem to notice it. Or worse, that maybe she did and simply didn't mind. One evening, Maggie sat alone in the living room, a pile of bridal magazines untouched on the coffee table. She picked up her phone thumb, hovering over Emily's name, wondering if she should call. Wondering if she should ask outright, "Am I still supposed to be part of this?" But she didn't. The fear of hearing an answer she wasn't ready to accept was paralyzing. Instead, she sat there in the dim light, listening to the faint ticking of the old wall clock, feeling herself being quietly edited out of a life she had once helped write every word of. She told herself it was normal. Girls grew up. They created their own families, their own traditions. This was what she had raised Emily to do, to fly to build her own nest, and yet the way it was happening so fast, so silently, felt less like growth and more like erasure. It wasn't supposed to feel like this. She was supposed to be standing at Emily's side, helping her hold the pieces together, not watching from a distance, unsure if she was even wanted at all. In the quiet that had begun creeping into every corner of her days, Maggie started to wonder if she had been wrong all along, if perhaps loving someone with your whole being was no guarantee that they would keep you close when they found someone else to share their world with. The truth was simple and devastating. Nathan hadn't pushed her out. Nathan had simply become the orbit Emily chose to revolve around. And Maggie. Maggie had been left behind, spinning in a space where she no longer belonged. Maggie straightened her blouse one more time before walking into the cafe. It was one of those trendy places that tried hard to look effortless, all reclaimed wood tables and oversized plants hanging from the ceiling. The sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting warm puddles of light onto the polished floor. She spotted them immediately. Nathan and his parents, Caroline and Robert, sitting at a corner table near the window. Emily was there too. Her blonde hair pulled back into a sleek ponytail. Her dress crisp and minimal, like something from a magazine ad. Maggie took a deep breath and walked toward them, clutching a small pamphlet in her handbag, a flyer for a local florist she hoped to suggest. Her heart beat a little faster, a mixture of nerves and excitement. Maybe today would be the day she would feel pulled back into the fold. Nathan stood politely as she approached Caroline. "Didn't bother, Mom," Emily said, glancing up briefly, offering a tight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You made it." The words were right, but the tone was wrong, flat, almost obligatory. Maggie swallowed the sting and smiled brightly. "Wouldn't miss it," she said, sliding into the empty chair beside Emily. Menus were passed around. Maggie asked the server if they had a vegetarian option, something light. Caroline let out a soft but unmistakable scoff behind her oversized sunglasses, which Maggie noticed she hadn't removed even indoors. "Oh, another one," Caroline muttered, lifting her mimosa glass with a smirk. Emily chuckled under her breath, eyes darting down to the menu as if she hadn't heard anything at all. Maggie froze for half a second, then forced a laugh. She wasn't going to make a scene. Not here, not now. The conversation turned to wedding plans, venues, guest lists, caterers. Maggie leaned in eager, holding herself back from dominating the discussion, but desperate to contribute to matter. When Nathan mentioned that they had just finalized the guest list, Maggie smiled and carefully pulled out the small pamphlet she had brought. It wasn't flashy, just a few samples from a local florist, one of her former students who had opened a boutique shop filled with wild, whimsical arrangements. "I thought maybe you'd want to take a look at these," Maggie said, offering the pamphlet across the table with a hopeful smile. "Sophie's work is really beautiful, and she's affordable too." Before Nathan could even glance at it, Emily reached across, plucked the pamphlet from Maggie's hand, and placed it face down on the table. "We've got it under control." "Mom," she said. Her voice clipped a tightness in her jaw, betraying the tension she was trying to mask. Maggie blinked, momentarily stunned. She opened her mouth to respond, to say she was only trying to help, but the words caught in her throat. The pamphlet sat between them, a folded rejection. The table grew heavy with silence. Nathan looked down at his plate. Robert cleared his throat and sipped his coffee. Caroline smirked again, as if witnessing a scene she had expected all along. Maggie felt the blood rush to her cheeks, a burning flush she couldn't hide. She laughed too brightly and tucked the pamphlet back into her bag. "Of course I didn't mean to overstep. Just thought, well, never mind." Emily gave a tight, polite smile and changed the subject, but the moment had already lodged itself in Maggie's chest, sharp and splintered. Not because Emily had a plan, not because she had made a decision without consulting her mother, but because of how easily she had dismissed her, how swiftly she had shut her out without even a second thought. It wasn't the flowers. It wasn't even about the wedding anymore. It was about being treated like a burden, like an afterthought, like a piece of furniture in a life Maggie had helped build from the ground up. The rest of the brunch passed in a blur. Maggie barely touched her salad. She nodded in the right places, laughed when expected, pretending she couldn't feel the slow, steady severing happening right in front of her. When the check came, she offered to pay for her meal, a habit of hers, but Emily waved her off. "We've got it," she said, meaning Nathan and his parents, meaning you're a guest here now, not family. Walking back to her car afterward, Maggie felt hollow. The spring air was cool and bright birds chattering in the trees, but inside her there was only silence. Not the soft, comforting silence of home, but the brittle, fragile silence of something breaking. For the first time since Emily had been born, Maggie felt like she was standing outside of her daughter's life, nose pressed against the glass, watching a scene unfold that no longer had a place for her. It was a small dismissal, one pamphlet, one brunch, but it was enough. It was the first undeniable proof that something precious had shifted, and Maggie, who had always promised herself she would never hold her daughter back, realized with a hollow ache that she wasn't holding anything at all anymore. It happened on an ordinary Thursday evening, the kind where Maggie tried to busy her hands just to keep her mind from wandering. She was in the kitchen, stirring a pot of vegetable soup, when her phone buzzed on the counter. Without thinking, she wiped her hands on a towel and picked it up. A notification flashed across the screen. "You've been added to Emily's Bridal Babes group chat." Her heart skipped a beat. At first, she smiled. Maybe she thought maybe Emily had realized she'd been distant. Maybe this was her way of reaching out, of bringing Maggie back into the excitement. A small olive branch. Maggie opened the group chat eagerly. At first, it was innocent enough. Photos of bridesmaid dresses being tried on in some upscale boutique, Pinterest screenshots of centerpiece ideas, inside jokes Maggie didn't understand. She scrolled, smiling despite herself, imagining what color dress Emily had chosen, wondering which of her friends would stand closest to her on the big day. And then she saw it. A message, casual but sharp. "Ari said her mom is gonna lose it if she's not front and center during the vows." Classic overbearing mom energy. Another message popped up right after. "Somebody please make sure she doesn't wear white. I swear I'll scream." A chorus of laughing emojis filled the chat. Someone else chimed in. "We seriously need a backup plan if she starts crying and making it about herself," Ari said. "She's just too much sometimes." Maggie froze. A strange roaring filled her ears. She scrolled up frantically, her thumb trembling, needing to believe she had misunderstood, that somehow it wasn't about her. But there it was. The nickname only a few close friends used. Ari, and the unmistakable implication. They were talking about her. And then among the stream of messages, she saw the one that broke something inside her completely, from Emily herself. "She means well. But honestly, everything turns into a guilt trip with her. I just don't have the energy for it right now." It was casual, tossed out like a line of dialogue in a conversation about floral arrangements or bachelorette parties. As if it cost Emily nothing to peel her mother down to a caricature in front of a dozen near strangers, Maggie sat down heavily at the kitchen table, the spoon from the soup pot slipping from her fingers and clattering against the counter. She didn't even flinch. The screen glowed in her hand, cruelly alive with jokes and gossip and plans for a day she had once imagined as shared between them. A day where she had pictured standing by her daughter's side, not being laughed about behind her back. For several long minutes, Maggie just sat there, reading every comment, every emoji, every careless dismissal. It was like peeling back the wall of a house and finding rot hidden beneath paint. A sickness she hadn't even realized was growing. She didn't respond. She didn't lash out or defend herself. There was no room for dignity. There. No audience willing to listen. Instead, she quietly pressed the button to leave the chat. No fanfare. No drama. Just gone. The silence that followed was somehow heavier than the noise. She stared at the blank phone screen, feeling the kind of loneliness that had nothing to do with being physically alone. This was a deeper solitude, the knowledge that the person you loved most in the world had chosen to make you the villain in their story. That somewhere along the way, the years of birthday cakes and midnight hugs and whispered promises had been repainted into something needy, something burdensome. It wasn't the betrayal of strangers that hurt the most. It was the betrayal of being so easily misunderstood, and not by outsiders, but by the very person whose life Maggie had shaped with her own 2 hands. She didn't cry. Not yet. The grief was too big, too dense, still coiling itself around her chest like smoke. Instead, Maggie stood up, walked to the stove, turned off the burner beneath the forgotten soup. She moved with slow mechanical precision, the way you do after hearing terrible news when your body hasn't quite caught up to your heart yet. She didn't tell anyone about the chat. Not her sister, not her friends. There was a shame in it, a rawness she couldn't bear to expose. Instead, that night, she folded the leather notebook she had once filled with wedding ideas and slid it into the back of her closet behind the winter coats she rarely wore anymore. She pulled the blush dress from the hanger and zipped it back into the garment bag without ceremony. She even boxed up the delicate heart necklace, the one she had designed months ago, when hope still bloomed in her chest like springtime. She didn't destroy any of it. She wasn't angry enough for that. She was simply done pretending. In the end, the group chat wasn't the cause of her exclusion. It was only the proof, undeniable, unalterable, that she had been written out of the story long before she realized it. And sometimes Maggie realized that was the cruelest betrayal of all. Not being pushed away with anger, but being quietly, almost carelessly erased. The text came the next morning just as the sun was beginning to rise, casting a soft, indifferent light across Maggie's kitchen. She had been awake for hours, unable to settle the group chat replaying in her mind like a broken record she couldn't turn off. Her phone buzzed on the countertop. One new message. It was from Emily. Maggie stared at the screen for a long moment before unlocking it. A part of her still hoped irrationally that it might be an apology, some last-minute realization, some small crack of light breaking through the hurt. Instead, the message was short, clinical. Hey, just confirming you don't need to be added to the seating chart, right? No greeting, no acknowledgement of the group chat. No regret, just logistics. Maggie's thumb hovered over the keyboard. At first, she typed a response, a long one spilling out the ache in her chest, the confusion, the betrayal. She deleted it. She tried again. Typing a cooler, more detached reply, something about misunderstanding, about still wanting to be there for her daughter. No matter what, she deleted that too. Finally, with fingers that barely seemed to obey her heart anymore, she typed 3 sentences. Yes, I won't be attending. I wish you a beautiful day. She hit send before she could think too much about it. The message blinked once, twice, and then disappeared into the silence between them. A silence that felt final, now heavy and complete. A silence that answered every question Maggie had been too afraid to ask out loud. She set the phone down and pressed both hands against the cool surface of the kitchen table, steadying herself. It was over, not with screaming or accusations, not with the kind of dramatic fight she'd always feared. No, this ending came in the form of a text. A few plain words. An erasure made official. There would be no seat for her at the wedding, no place set aside to honor the years of scraped knees, bandaged science projects built late into the night, lullabies hummed through fevers and nightmares. There would be no acknowledgement of the countless sacrifices Maggie had folded quietly into the corners of Emily's life. No, whispered, "Thank you, Mom," at the end of the aisle. No tearful hug after the vows. Just an empty chair, or perhaps not even that. The loss wasn't just about the day. It was about every day that would come after, colored by the knowledge that when it mattered most, Emily had chosen to close the door, and Maggie hadn't even been allowed to knock. Moving slowly, as if her body were underwater. Maggie stood and crossed to the hallway closet. She pulled out the garment bag, the blush-colored dress she had picked so carefully, the one she had imagined, would blend into the soft glow of fairy lights and golden photographs. She unzipped it, tracing the delicate fabric with her fingertips. Then, without ceremony, she folded it neatly back into the bag, zipped it up, and slid it under her bed out of sight. Next came the small velvet box, the necklace, a heart-shaped pendant forged from her own mother's wedding ring engraved with the words, "Always your mom." It had been meant as a token, a blessing, a reminder that no matter how far Emily traveled, Maggie's love would be stitched into her life like an invisible thread. She placed the necklace back in its box, tied the ribbon once more, and tucked it away into a drawer. Safe. Silent. Finally, Maggie walked into the guest room, the one she had painted a soft lilac, thinking Emily and Nathan might stay there after the wedding. She folded the towels she had set out, packed away the candles, dismantled the small, hopeful preparations she had made without even realizing she was making them. It wasn't rage she felt. It wasn't even heartbreak anymore. It was acceptance. Cold and clean, Maggie realized as she moved through her house, undoing all the little threads she had once woven with so much anticipation, that she didn't need a seat at the wedding to validate what she had given. The love she had poured into raising Emily didn't vanish just because Emily had outgrown it or failed to honor it. It existed. It mattered, even if no one else remembered. The silence wasn't a punishment. It was an answer. And Maggie finally understood. Sometimes the absence of an invitation is the clearest message you'll ever receive. As the afternoon sun shifted across the floor, casting long, gentle shadows, Maggie made herself a cup of tea, not because she needed it, but because she deserved it. She sat by the window, sipping slowly, staring out at a world that kept spinning, despite her broken heart. And somewhere deep inside her, a tiny, trembling voice. Her own whispered, "You are still here. You are still whole. You are still you." For the first time in weeks, Maggie believed it. The first thing Maggie did was delete the folder labeled Emily's Wedding from her laptop. It wasn't an impulsive move. It was deliberate, measured, almost ceremonial. She hovered the mouse over the folder, a collection of vendor lists, inspirational photos, handwritten notes, scanned carefully into neat PDFs. And for a long moment, she simply stared. Each file was a love letter she had written without knowing it. Each image, each plan had carried the hope of being a part of something. Now they were just weight. Heavy reminders of invitations never sent. Conversations never had. With a steady hand, she dragged the folder to the trash. Then she emptied it. No fanfare, no second guessing. The screen blinked. Gone. Maggie sat back in her chair and let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. It didn't hurt as much as she thought it would, or maybe the hurt had simply dulled to something she could finally carry without collapsing under it. She closed the laptop and turned her attention to the old leather-bound journal tucked away on the bookshelf. Its spine was cracked, the edges of the pages yellowed with time. She hadn't written in it in years, not since the days when Emily was still young enough to climb into her lap, jabbering stories about dragons and fairy princesses demanding Maggie write them down. Maggie opened to a blank page, the paper rough under her fingertips. She picked up a pen and, hesitating only briefly, began to write. Not about Emily, not about the wedding, about herself, about the woman she had been before motherhood consumed her. The woman who used to dream about traveling across the country in a beat-up car with nothing but a map and a suitcase full of paperbacks. The woman who once thought she might publish a collection of short stories, who loved rainy afternoons spent curled up by a window with Miles Davis playing softly in the background. That woman wasn't gone. She had just been sleeping, waiting for Maggie to come back. After a few pages, Maggie set down the pen. Her handwriting was rusty. Her words awkward, but she smiled anyway. It was a start. Her start. That evening, she lit a candle in the living room, a simple vanilla scent that filled the space with warmth and light. She opened her old record player and dusted off a vinyl of soft jazz, letting the low hum of saxophones and slow piano chords fill the air. For the first time in weeks, the house didn't feel like a tomb. It felt like a sanctuary, A place where Maggie wasn't mourning a lost role. A place where she was rediscovering the parts of herself that had always been there, waiting patiently beneath the layers of grief. When the last notes of the record faded into silence, Maggie stood and crossed the room to the small drawer where she had tucked away the necklace, the delicate heart-shaped pendant she had intended to give Emily. She opened the box, slowly cradling it in her hands. It had been made from her mother's wedding ring, melted down and reshaped into something new. A piece of legacy, a thread connecting generations. It no longer belonged to Emily. Not now. Maybe not ever. And that was okay. Maggie unclasped the chain and fastened it around her own neck. Her fingers fumbled slightly, but eventually the charm rested against her collarbone, warm and light. She looked at her reflection in the window. The silhouette of a woman standing tall, shoulders back, chin lifted. The necklace wasn't a symbol of rejection anymore. It was a keepsake of resilience, a reminder that love given freely was never wasted, even if it wasn't returned the way she had hoped. It had shaped her, strengthened her. Maggie placed her palm lightly over the pendant, feeling its small, steady weight. "I am still here," she whispered aloud. "I am still me." Outside, the first hints of twilight painted the sky in shades of lavender and blue. Maggie turned off the overhead lights, letting the soft glow of the candle guide her through the house. In the quiet, she didn't feel abandoned. She didn't feel invisible. She felt free. It was a different kind of love story now, not one centered on a daughter or a wedding or a role she no longer occupied. It was a story about coming home to herself. And as Maggie curled up on the sofa journal resting beside her, music drifting softly into the night, she realized something she hadn't known she was searching for. She wasn't letting go of Emily. She was letting go of the need to be chosen. And in that letting go, she was finally gloriously choosing herself. It was a Sunday morning, clear and sharp, the kind where the air felt just a little too crisp to be comforting. Maggie had just returned from the library, a new novel tucked under her arm, when she noticed the car idling quietly in front of her house. At first, she didn't recognize it. A modest gray sedan, unremarkable except for the figure sitting rigidly behind the wheel. Nathan. He looked different than the last time she had seen him standing tall and polished at the brunch months ago. Now he seemed smaller somehow. Shoulders hunched, hands gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping him tethered. Maggie hesitated at the bottom of her driveway. Part of her wanted to turn around to retreat into the quiet safety of her home. But something, a flicker of old instinct of openness she hadn't yet fully extinguished, nudged her forward. She tapped lightly on the window. Nathan jumped slightly, then rolled it down. "Hi, Mrs. Bennett," he said, voice hoarse. "Hi, Nathan," she replied, careful to keep her tone even. "Would you like to come in?" He nodded too quickly, like a man desperate for shelter, but unsure he deserved it. Inside, Maggie moved about the kitchen without asking if he wanted anything, automatically making 2 cups of tea. Muscle memory from years of hosting Emily's friends through every phase of adolescence. They sat at the table, the same spot where Maggie had once imagined planning wedding seating charts, laughing over color schemes. Now it felt like neutral ground. Nathan fidgeted with his mug, staring down into the steam. Finally, he spoke. I don't really know how to start this," he said, glancing up at her briefly before looking away again. "I didn't come to apologize for Emily. I know that's not my place." Maggie nodded, once wordless. Nathan took a deep breath. "I found the letter," he said quietly. "The one you wrote." "It was still in the car under the seat. She never even opened the gift." Maggie's chest tightened, but she said nothing. She let the silence work as she was learning to do. "I read it," Nathan continued, voice cracking slightly. "I know I shouldn't have. It wasn't meant for me, but when I found it, I don't know. Something didn't sit right. I had to know." Maggie folded her hands around her teacup to keep them from trembling. "I guess I needed to see for myself." Nathan said, his eyes finally meeting hers. Because the way Emily talked about you, it didn't line up. She said you were overbearing, controlling, that you made her feel trapped, suffocated. He shook his head slowly. But that letter, it was the most selfless, loving thing I've ever read. Maggie blinked hard against the sting in her eyes. She hadn't realized how much she needed someone else to see her until now. Nathan leaned back, exhaling sharply. I think, he said carefully, that Emily was scared, not of you exactly, but of not living up to you, of disappointing you. Maggie absorbed his words slowly, letting them settle. I understand that, she said softly. Fear can make people do terrible things, especially when it's dressed up as independence. Nathan nodded. She loves you, he said. I know she does, but she got so caught up in trying to be her own person that she thought she had to cut everything else away to do it. There was no malice in his tone, only sadness. Maggie smiled faintly, not bitterly, but with the kind of weary grace that comes after too many sleepless nights. I didn't need to be at the center of her world, she said. I just wanted to be allowed to stand at the edge. Nathan's hands tightened around his mug. For what it's worth, he said quietly. If I had known, if I had understood sooner, I would have made sure you had a seat. Maggie touched the heart pendant resting against her collarbone, a reminder that she didn't need anyone else's permission to hold her place in this world. I appreciate that, she said simply. They sat in silence for a few minutes, the kind that wasn't heavy but companionable. Like two people who understood that some wounds weren't meant to be filled with words. Before he left, Nathan stood awkwardly hesitating by the door. I don't know where things go from here, he admitted. But I didn't want you to think no one saw you. Maggie smiled again, this time a little stronger. Thank you, Nathan, she said, for coming, for seeing. He nodded once, then turned and left the door clicking softly shut behind him. Maggie stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of the encounter settle around her like a well-worn coat. Not heavy, not painful, just real. For the first time in months, she realized something essential, something she had almost forgotten in the noise of her grief. The truth has a way of finding its way to the light, even when everything else tries to bury it. And sometimes being seen by even one person was enough to remind you that you had never been invisible at all. It arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, tucked between a stack of grocery coupons and a bank statement Maggie had no intention of opening. At first, she didn't notice it. Just another envelope in a sea of forgettable paper. But when she pulled it free, her breath caught. Her name was written across the front in looping familiar handwriting. Emily's handwriting. Maggie stood frozen in the hallway for a long moment, the letter trembling lightly in her hands. It wasn't a text message. It wasn't an email. It was deliberate, personal, heavy, in a way nothing else had been in months. She didn't open it right away. Instead, she set it gently on the kitchen table, brewed a cup of tea, and sat down across from it like it was a fragile animal she might spook if she moved too quickly. When she finally peeled back the envelope and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside, she found a letter short, unadorned, but pulsing with weight. Mom, I don't know how to start this. I've rewritten it about 6 times. I keep thinking about what I would want to hear if I were you. And honestly, I don't even know. But I do know this. I hurt you. I pushed you away from something we should have shared, and I did it because I was scared. Maggie swallowed hard, her fingers gripping the edges of the page. I wasn't scared of you. I was scared of failing you, of not being able to live up to the version of me that you always believed in. You've always been so strong, Mom. So constant. You made everything feel possible, even when it wasn't. And somewhere along the way, I convinced myself that if I let you in too close during this new chapter of my life, it would be like I was admitting I couldn't do it without you. I wanted so badly to prove that I was independent, that I was enough on my own. And in doing that, I forgot that you were never trying to hold me back. You were always the reason I could even stand tall in the first place. Maggie blinked against the tears blurring her vision. "I don't expect you to forgive me just because I'm saying I'm sorry. I know words aren't enough. I just want you to know that I see it now. I see you, and I see all the things I was too selfish and too scared to appreciate before I miss you. Mom, love, Emily." The letter slipped from Maggie's fingers onto the table. She leaned back in her chair, one hand covering her mouth, letting the tears fall freely now, not sharp and broken like before, but slow, warm cleansing. It wasn't an excuse. It wasn't a justification wrapped in guilt. It was an acknowledgement, a reaching across the distance that had grown so wide between them, a small trembling first step towards something different, something maybe even stronger than what had existed before. Maggie closed her eyes and let herself sit with the words, feeling them settle deep inside the places that had been raw and empty for too long. Emily hadn't tried to erase what she had done. She hadn't tried to minimize the hurt or shift the blame. She had simply bravely laid her heart open. For the first time in months, Maggie didn't feel like she was shouting into a void. She didn't feel erased. She didn't feel invisible. She felt seen. The pain was still there. Yes, some scars don't vanish with a single apology, but it no longer screamed inside her. It no longer defined her. Maggie picked up the letter again, folding it neatly along the creases, and placed it carefully inside her journal between two blank pages. Not an ending. Not a return to the past. A beginning. Small and fragile and entirely real. She pressed her hand over the closed book, feeling the heartbeat of it against her skin. A reminder that sometimes healing doesn't arrive in grand gestures or perfect timing. Sometimes it comes in the form of a simple truth finally spoken aloud. Outside, the sky had deepened into late afternoon gold. The world continued to turn. And inside Maggie's kitchen, the first tiny bridge between two hearts had been built, not wide enough yet to cross completely, but strong enough to believe in. And sometimes Maggie realized that was all you needed. The following week, Maggie found herself standing outside the town library, the wind teasing the edges of the flyer she clutched in her hand, seeking volunteer tutors for children's reading program. All experience levels welcome. The paper was simple, unassuming, just a few black letters on a bright yellow background. But to Maggie, it felt like an invitation to step back into the world. Not as someone's mother, not as an afterthought, but as herself. She walked through the heavy oak doors, the smell of old paper and quiet purpose wrapping around her like a familiar blanket. Inside, a woman with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes welcomed her warmly, handed her a clipboard and introduced her to the other volunteers. Within a week, Maggie was sitting cross-legged on a faded rug. A group of second graders sprawled around her, their eager faces tilted up expectantly. She opened a picture book, bright and whimsical, and began to read aloud. At first, her voice trembled slightly out of nerves, or maybe the lingering weight of grief. But as she turned the pages and as the children's laughter bubbled up around her, something inside Maggie began to uncoil. Here, among sticky fingers and gap-toothed smiles, she wasn't defined by what she had lost. She wasn't measured by her absence from a wedding guest list. She wasn't seen as too much or overbearing. She was simply a voice telling a story, a hand helping to sound out a difficult word, a presence that mattered in small, sturdy ways. Every Thursday morning, she returned slowly, weaving herself into the fabric of the library's quiet bustle, and every week, the ache in her chest grew a little lighter, but it wasn't just tutoring. One afternoon, as she lingered near the community bulletin board, another flyer caught her eye. Writer's Circle. Share your stories, find your voice. Wednesdays at 6 p.m. Maggie smiled a little sadly. She hadn't written anything real in years, not since her journal entries had shifted from dreams to grocery lists. But the idea tugged at something deep inside her, something she thought had withered beyond reach. That Wednesday, she walked into a small meeting room lined with mismatched chairs and tables strewn with notebooks and coffee cups. She chose a seat at the back. Notebook clutched tight against her chest like a shield. The group was a strange, beautiful mix. A retired journalist, a college student studying poetry. a young mother writing children's stories. No one asked her why she was there. No one pried into the hollows of her life. They simply welcomed her with a nod, a space and an invitation to speak when she was ready. It took her 3 weeks. 3 weeks of listening, scribbling half-finished paragraphs in her notebook, telling herself she wasn't ready. 3 weeks of gathering the courage to unfold her story. When she finally did, her voice wavered only slightly. She read a piece about loss. Not the dramatic, earth-shattering kind, but the quiet, unglamorous erosion of being forgotten by someone you once built your life around. She wrote about the ache of disappearing, about the beauty of finding yourself again in the unlikeliest places, about the defiant hope that blooms even after everything else has withered. When she finished, the room was silent, not uncomfortable reverent. Then came the applause, soft but real, and for the first time in what felt like years, Maggie felt like she had been heard without being judged, like her story mattered. The group organizer, a woman with silver hair and laugh lines etched deep around her mouth, approached her afterward. "Would you be willing to have it published in our quarterly anthology?" she asked. Maggie blinked, stunned. I've never been published," she stammered. The woman smiled. "You have now." Weeks later, when the slim booklet arrived in the mail, Maggie turned to the page bearing her story. Her name sat neatly above the title, the spaces between a story of losing and finding. She traced the letters with a fingertip, a quiet pride blooming inside her. It wasn't about fame, it wasn't about validation. It was about reclaiming the parts of herself that had existed long before and would continue to exist long after anyone else's approval. Sitting in her living room that evening, the necklace resting against her heart, Maggie realized a simple, profound truth. Her life was not defined by the roles she had been given or stripped of. She was not just a mother, not just an afterthought, not just a background character in someone else's story. She was a woman, a storyteller, a builder of her own life. "I am more than a mother," she whispered aloud, smiling at the words as they hung warmly in the quiet room, and this rediscovery was only the beginning. The Maple and Pine Cafe looked almost exactly the same as it had when Maggie and Emily used to visit it years ago. The same honey-colored wood floors, the same chipped chalkboard menu, boasting endless varieties of coffee and 2 sweet pastries. Maggie arrived early as she always did. She chose a table by the window, their old favorite, and ordered 2 coffees black for herself, a caramel latte for Emily. A small act of hope, not expectation. As she waited, she ran her fingers over the edge of her coffee cup, grounding herself in the present. She wasn't here to erase the past. She wasn't here to demand apologies or force amends. She was here because healing wasn't a destination. It was a road best walked slowly, deliberately. The bell above the door jingled and Maggie looked up. There she was. Emily stood in the doorway looking smaller than Maggie remembered, not physically, but emotionally. Her posture wasn't defensive, but tentative. She clutched her purse like it was a shield for a heartbeat neither of them moved. Then Emily smiled, small, tentative, and crossed the room. "Hi, Mom," she said softly, sliding into the seat across from her. "Hi, sweetheart," Maggie replied, careful to keep her voice steady, open. They sat in silence for a moment, the clink of silverware and soft hum of conversations around them filling the space. Emily reached for the coffee Maggie had ordered, for her eyes widening slightly when she saw it. "You remembered," she murmured, almost to herself. "Of course," Maggie said simply. They sipped their coffee, the first few minutes passing without any heavy words. Instead, they talked about neutral things, the weather, a book Maggie was reading, a funny story Emily told about a new coworker. No mention of the wedding. No dredging up the bruises of the past. Not yet. It was like relearning each other's rhythms, hesitantly reaching for old familiarity without forcing it. Every conversation, every smile was a cautious stitch pulling them closer together. After a while, Emily fidgeted with her napkin, folding and unfolding it into tiny, trembling squares. "I don't know how to do this," she said suddenly, her voice cracking slightly. "I don't know the right words or the right steps. I just know I want to try." Maggie's heart ached at the rawness of it. She set her coffee down gently, choosing her next words carefully. "We don't have to figure it out all at once," she said. "We just start, and we see where it goes." Emily's shoulders sagged in relief. "I'm scared," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Of messing it up again, of not being enough." Maggie reached across the table, not grasping, just resting her hand, palm up, and offering. "You were never not enough, Emily," she said. "Not for a second." Tears welled in Emily's eyes, but she blinked them back, pressing her lips together tightly. She didn't reach for Maggie's hand, not yet, but the invitation hung between them, real and patient. They spent the next hour talking not about the past directly, but weaving around it carefully, acknowledging it in small ways without reopening every wound. Emily told Maggie about work, about the baking class she had signed up for on a whim. Maggie told Emily about the tutoring sessions, the group of second graders who insisted she read Where the Wild Things Are 3 times in a row. They laughed, tentatively at first, then more freely. It wasn't the way things used to be. It wasn't a magical restoration of the past. It was something new, something quieter but perhaps stronger for its honesty. As they stood to leave, Maggie didn't press for another meeting. She didn't beg for promises or plans. She simply smiled and said, "I'd love to do this again sometime if you'd like." Emily nodded quickly, almost eagerly. "I'd like that," she said, "a lot." They hugged, not the tight, desperate hug of fixing everything at once, but a careful, genuine embrace. It was enough. As Maggie walked back to her car, the autumn breeze ruffling the hem of her coat, she realized she wasn't hoping to rebuild the exact house they had once lived in together. She was planting seeds for something new, something slower perhaps, but real, and sometimes tentative steps are the strongest ones of all. A week later, Emily showed up at Maggie's door, a cardboard box cradled awkwardly in her arms. Her knock was soft, almost hesitant, like she wasn't sure she would be welcome. Maggie opened the door with a small smile. No fanfare, no awkward questions, just space open and waiting. "I found some old things," Emily said, shifting the box against her hip. "Photos, drawings, cards. I thought maybe we could, I don't know, make something out of them." Maggie stepped aside, holding the door wide. "Of course," she said. "Come in." They settled at the kitchen table, the same table that had once witnessed pancake breakfasts. School projects whispered secrets over cocoa mugs. Today it would witness something else, a rebuilding not rushed, not forced, but stitched together carefully like a quilt from frayed pieces. Emily opened the box and began pulling out the treasures. A faded drawing of a stick figure family. Emily's first depiction of herself and Maggie, hand in hand under a wobbly sun. Birthday cards written in shaky, oversized letters. Polaroids from camping trips. Beach vacations. Random afternoons at the park. Maggie felt her throat tighten, but she didn't let the sadness overtake her. Today was not for mourning what was lost. It was for honoring what had been real. They worked slowly, sifting through the past with gentle hands. Maggie found a program from Emily's first piano recital, the one where she had tripped climbing onto the stage and still played through tears. Emily found a crumpled, glitter-covered Mother's Day card. "You are my best mommy and my best friend," written in purple crayon. They didn't talk much at first. The memories spoke for themselves. At one point, Emily paused, holding up a photograph of them both at the beach, wrapped in matching striped towels. Wide grins plastered across their sunburned faces. "I don't remember the exact day," Emily said, her voice soft, almost wondering. "But I remember how safe I felt." Maggie swallowed the lump in her throat and reached out to smooth the photo onto a scrapbook page. She didn't need to say anything. It was enough that Emily had remembered the feeling. The rest would come in time. They cut, pasted, arranged. Little by little, the empty pages filled. A ticket stub from a children's play they had attended. A pressed daisy from a long-forgotten hike. A handwritten note Emily had left once after a bad day at school. Thanks for being my soft place to land. At first, Maggie had worried the project might stir up resentment, that the weight of all that had been broken might seep into the work. But it didn't. Instead, they worked side by side, acknowledging the past without drowning in it, respecting it, allowing it to simply exist, imperfect, beautiful whole. Every sticker they placed, every caption they wrote beneath a picture, was a quiet act of healing. It wasn't about fixing everything. It was about saying, this happened. It mattered. We mattered. As twilight crept in and the living room filled with the scent of vanilla candles and the faint strains of an old Ella Fitzgerald record spinning in the background, Maggie realized how different this moment felt. There was no tension, no desperate undercurrent of needing to prove or repair, just two women, a mother and a daughter sharing space, breathing in the same memories with new understanding. As they neared the end of the box, Emily picked up the last item, the heart-shaped pendant Maggie had once intended to give her on her wedding day. Emily turned it over in her hand, tracing the engraved words silently. After a moment, she looked up. "I'm not ready yet," she said quietly. "But someday, I'd like to wear it." Maggie smiled. Not with sadness, not with longing, but with a deep, steady peace. "Whenever you're ready," she said. "No pressure, no timeline." Emily nodded, her shoulders loosening, and placed the necklace gently atop the final page they had decorated. A photo of a birthday cake, candles half blown out. Both of them, mid-laugh. They sat back, surveying their work. The scrapbook wasn't polished, it wasn't perfect. There were smudges and crooked stickers and pages that didn't quite align, but it was honest, it was theirs. Maggie ran a hand lightly over the closed book. Healing hadn't come with a grand apology or a sweeping reunion. It had come with scissors glue, laughter, and the quiet agreement to build something new from what remained. Not by forgetting. Not by pretending the pain hadn't existed, but by choosing intentionally, bravely to honor the good alongside the grief. As Emily stood to leave, they hugged again. This time longer. This time with both arms wrapped around each other fully. Outside, the sky stretched wide and dark, but inside Maggie's house, there was only warmth. And as she placed the scrapbook on the shelf beside her old journals, Maggie realized something powerful. The past didn't define them. The hurt didn't either. What defined them was the choice to keep writing their story. One honest, imperfect page at a time. The first hints of spring crept into the air, a softness in the breeze, the faintest green dusting the branches that had stood bare for so long. Maggie noticed it not because she was looking for it, but because for the first time in months she had begun looking outward again. Life hadn't changed overnight. Emily didn't call every day. There were still long stretches of silence between them, gaps filled with tentative hope rather than certainty. And yet, something fundamental had shifted. The difference wasn't in how often they spoke or how quickly they patched over the past. It was in the way Maggie had stopped measuring her life by the shape of Emily's presence. One Saturday morning, Maggie sat on her porch, a mug of tea warming her hands, the scrapbook resting on the table beside her. She flipped through its pages, slowly smiling at the messiness, the crooked stickers, the memories layered thick and real across the bright paper. It wasn't a perfect history. It wasn't a linear story. But it was theirs. As she traced a photograph of Emily at age 5, grinning toothlessly, holding up a finger paint masterpiece with pride, Maggie felt a deep, steady peace bloom inside her. She hadn't lost her daughter. She hadn't lost herself. She had simply, painfully, beautifully outgrown the old ways they had fit together. Their love wasn't the consuming, dependent kind it had once been. It was something looser. Now more fragile, maybe, but also more honest. And Maggie understood with a clarity she hadn't possessed before that she didn't need Emily to complete her. She loved her. She always would. But her worth, her wholeness, her right to take up space in the world, none of it hinged on being someone's mother. She was a woman who had built a life from scratch. A woman who had loved fiercely and survived the fallout of that love without letting it hollow her out completely. Around her neck, the delicate heart-shaped pendant rested against her skin. It no longer felt like a wound or a question unanswered. It was a quiet declaration. I have endured. I am still here. I am still me. The necklace wasn't about Emily anymore. It was about resilience. About the kind of love that survives even when it has no place to land. About choosing every day to live a life that honors the woman she had always been: independent, strong, tender-hearted. Later that afternoon, Maggie drove into town, walking slowly through the farmer's market. She bought a small bunch of daffodils, their bright yellow heads bobbing cheerfully in the breeze, and tucked them into the passenger seat beside her. An offering not to anyone else, but to herself. When she returned home, she placed the flowers in a jar on the kitchen table, their color spilling warmth into the room. She sat back, sipping her tea, feeling for the first time in a long time. Not like she was waiting for life to start again. Life was already happening. The phone rang later that evening. Emily's name lit up the screen. Maggie smiled and answered without hesitation. Their conversation was short plans for coffee next weekend. A new recipe Emily wanted to try. Nothing dramatic, nothing earth-shattering. Just connection. Simple, steady, real. After they hung up, Maggie sat for a long moment in the quiet, not mourning, not yearning, just grateful. Grateful for what had survived, grateful for what she had reclaimed, grateful most of all for herself. The woman who had walked through fire and come out, not unscathed but unbroken. Outside, the stars blinked faintly into existence. Inside, Maggie pressed her palm lightly over the pendant at her chest, feeling its familiar weight. It was no longer a reminder of what she had lost. It was a promise of everything she had found. And as she stood to close the curtains against the deepening night, Maggie whispered not to Emily, not to the past, but to herself. I am whole. I am enough. And I am loved by the life I've built, by the woman I've become. It wasn't the ending she once imagined. It was something better, a different kind of love. One that didn't need constant affirmation or flawless closeness to survive. One built on choice, on quiet strength, on the resilience of a heart that refused to stay broken. And Maggie knew as she turned out the lights and climbed into bed that whatever chapters lay ahead, she would meet them not with fear, but with open hands, ready to write the next part of her story, not as someone's forgotten afterthought, but as the vibrant, whole, beautifully imperfect woman she had always been.